Ramsey County Master Gardeners. In my normal pre-COVID life, I'm the volunteer program coordinator at the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. I share an office with Diane Grivey and Delisha Davis. And while I am working from home, my boss, Tim Kenny, asked if I would like to help out with this particular program after Jamie's retirement. So I was excited to do that, and I'm looking forward to getting to know all of you. I see a couple of familiar faces.
So how are you our
new fearless leader?
Oh, I wouldn't say that. I'm plenty fearful, and I'm just barely. Brianna's leading, and I'm tagging along for the ride and helping with administrative work and answering a lot of emails.
Better you than me. So thank you, Kim.
I'm hoping.
We do appreciate the help a lot, if I haven't said that enough.
Well, it's nice to meet all of you, because I'm hoping to take some of the Zoom hosting off of Brianna's plate if it makes sense to do it. So you might be seeing a little bit more of me here and there.
And
in
how do they
addition
reach
to
you?
emails,
How do they get in touch with you, Kim?
Oh, you can email me at the rcmg@umn.edu email. It's Jamie Ossendorf's old email address. And I'm working on getting the phone number and access to the phone line, but I don't know that number yet.
something else that would be really helpful is if we could get access to our mail. If someone is doing administrative things, that would be really helpful.
Yep, Diane is trying to facilitate a little meeting between me and, is it Tammy, the regional? And so I should be able to collect the mail within the next week or so here.
Fabulous. Thank you.
I'm guessing you're watching for something, huh, Loretta?
Well, I'm looking for several things, yes.
Part of the problem has been an inability to get over to the barn because it's been closed to staff and public. I know that our office staff, Brenda Slaughter, has been collecting the mail. And Kim, I can help a little bit with phone number if you want. So we can connect.
That would be great.
Later, yeah.
Thank you, Jamie. All right, so if we want to get started, Nilgam, do you want to do an introduction? And Dr. Rao, how do we want to share your presentation? I think you have, I made you a co-host, so you should be able to see the share screen button at the bottom.
Yep.
Awesome. All right, if you are not a presenter, then mute your microphone and get out of the way.
I'd like to introduce Dr. Rao, and most of you are familiar with her already because she gave us a wonderful presentation on edible insects last spring. And at that time, way back then, I approached her about doing this presentation about Insectmageddon. As you know, a large percentage of our insects have disappeared, and she's going to talk to us about why and what we can do about it. She is a professor of entomology and the department chair at the university. And one of her areas of interest is native pollinators in agricultural and natural landscapes. So this is a natural topic for her, I'd say, and we're very thrilled to have her. So please welcome Dr. Rao.
Thank you, Nilgun. Thank you all very much for the invitation. I'm indeed honored to be asked to come back and give a talk on something different. And this one has been really exciting because it's been a learning experience for me too. So I'm going to share my screen now, and please let me know if you cannot see it. I think I have to go back here and then, More challenging than I thought this would be. I think it's because there you go. Can you see now?
Looks good.
Okay. So what happens, what I found with Zoom is that one has to actually prepare your slides differently, because all these different bars reduce the space that you can actually see. So hopefully this will go well. Okay, so I thought I'll give you a little background myself. I'm from India, way over there. And I came to, when I was in India, I got excited about insects. It was really a cicada that got me interested. In India, insects are primarily pests. I grew up in a city like New York, so the only things we encounter are cockroaches and things like that. So, and Indians, most people are like engineers and doctors, and so if someone wants to do entomology, it was really way outside the box. But I got really excited. It was the cicada when we went collecting as an entomologist kept eluding me, and that kind of hooked me onto the field. And so I worked in India at a couple of places, and then, but I really wasn't getting much training in things like ecological interactions and things like that. And so I decided to come to the US to get a PhD. And where did I land? Minnesota. People ask me why Minnesota, and honestly, sitting in India in 40 degrees centigrade temperature, when someone tells you it's minus 40 centigrade, in Minnesota, it's like, how cold can it be? You really have no idea as to, cold. And of course, we don't know anything about wind chill factors or the polar vortex or any of that stuff. Ignorance is bliss. And so here I was. And I did my PhD looking at interactions, of course, corn. Even soybean wasn't there in those days. It was primarily corn, looking at an interaction between an insect and its natural enemy, and looking at sort of volatiles and how the parasitoid natural enemy is attracted. I went over to the East Coast and continued similar work looking at the adult stage, and then moved all the way across the country to California and worked in strawberries and biocontrol, looking at a natural enemy of a pest. Then from there, I got a job as an extension agent. So now my job was to actually help the farmers with their pest management issues. From there, I moved to Oregon, and from the strawberry fields forever to the green grass of home. And while I was working with this one pest, it was attracted to this pheromone, which is on this yellow sticky card. A company didn't want me to use those sticky cards because they're kind of messy. And so they gave me this trap to use. And it didn't catch the pest, but it just caught a lot of bees. And, as Nilgun mentioned, that's how I got into studying native bees and pollination. And then after working there for years, the department of entomology here asked me to apply for the department head position. And so here I am, back again in Oregon, in Minnesota from Oregon. And, I've done the pest management, I've done semiochemicals, done pollinators. So it's like, what should I do now? Well, that's how I got into edible insects. So that's kind of a brief background of all the different things I've done entomological speaking. And so with that, I'll get started on what I'm going to talk about today, which is I thought I'd share with you my perspective, global reports that there have been there about insect declines, what are the factors responsible, why it matters, and what can we do to address the issue. And if you have any questions in between, I suppose Brianna will help me answer them, since I probably won't be paying attention to the chat box unless it pops up in the middle.
No,
So
we got you covered.
global reports about insect declines. Well, the one that most people are familiar with is what happened with the honeybee. And it was this really famous now Pennsylvania beekeeper in 2006 who first drew attention. He picked up his frames and found that a lot of them were, empty. And it's like the bees were not coming home. And so that problem is what we now know as the colony collapse disorder. Well, honeybees, they're the European honeybee. They're not really, it should be European honeybee hives there. They're not native. They're from Europe. And they're being domesticated. So we're not really talking about native insects here. But what it did is that this research on issues with the European honeybee led to studies that showed that there were global declines in native bees and other solitary bees too. And so again, close to home, the rusty patch bumblebee, bee which was very, very common across many states, is now close to extinction, according to the US Fish and Wildlife. So this is an example right here, but there have been other examples too. So this is a bee, the great yellow bumblebee, which is present in different parts of Europe, but it's now endangered in Ireland. And then the Bombas Occidentalis, which is a short-haired bumblebee that's native to Europe, England, and it's not been seen in UK since 1988. So again, just snippets of examples. And then we're all familiar with, again, the iconic butterfly, the monarch butterfly, very well known for its migration in fall to places in Mexico and California, and then also how it returns. And if anybody has had a chance to see, it is just a glorious sight. You have these pods and pods and pods of monarchs just hanging. And the ones I saw in California, they were on eucalyptus, which is not even a native. So it's kind of interesting how that interaction evolved. But, people have been watching over the years and finding that the areas over which you have these pods and pods of my monarchs hanging has decreased from what it was in the 90s to now, and you do see slight increases now, but this is another example where there's been evidence of a decline. And then more recently, last year there was the article, the insect kind of brought attention to the insect apocalypse. In England is where actually they have a lot of entomologists, a lot of studies and data from, long periods of time. And so they're, estimating that there's going to be a reduction in insect populations. And then, of course, more recently, many of you all may have seen this article in Science, at least the report that came out of it, which essentially said that terrestrial insects are declining by about 9% per decade, whereas aquatic insects have actually increased. So just to give you an idea, how do people do the studies? How can you possibly figure out things like this? Well, in this particular case, they looked at over 160 surveys that were conducted, which were at least 10 years or more at, over 1676 sites. And some of the data is as early as 1928, but a lot of the data is more recent, from the 80s and more recent, mostly from North America, little information from some countries like Africa, India, Australia. And then one of the important things from this is, yes, you see the increase in freshwater, but then freshwater, represents very small percentage of what we have on planet Earth. So what are freshwater insects? Well, some of you all are familiar with kind of the adult stages, but may or may not know that the immature stages of these live in fresh water. So you have the dragonfly, it's beautiful damselfly. You can see the immature looks different, mayflies, and then caddisflies, which kind of pick up pebbles and different things in the water to create these shelters. And then again, people may or may not recognize the dobson fly, helgramites. They're great for, those who are fly fishermen. Mosquitoes, not everybody knows that the immatures are in water. And then there's some beetle, like this diving beetle, which you can see is predatory. You can see how it's actually feeding on a fish there. And then some of y'all may know about, what's known as the wind chill phenomenon or the windscreen phenomena. It's basically anecdotal observation that we do tend to see fewer insects on our windscreen now compared to, a decade or a couple of decades ago. And so, we, after a very long drive, we don't have to be cleaning our windshields like we used to. So suggesting there's a decrease in population. Well, personally, yes, I do feel that I'm not cleaning my windshield as much now as I used to, but I'm kind of having a hard time, the difference that I see in terms of differences in insects. But then in Britain, they did a study where motorists were asked to attach PVC film to their number plate, license plate. And so, to get a sense of insects that were colliding with it as they drove. And they called it the splatometer. And they found that one insect was squashed for every 5 miles of driving. And so it represents one of the few pieces of data to this windscreen phenomenon. Of course, they don't have any kind of, you need to have a before and now, old data, new data to actually tell the difference. But if somebody wants to do the study in the future, then there's that data set to compare with. So people did feel that there was a reduction. So I think one of the points here too is that studies are as good as the data that is used for the study. And with something like insects, it's well nigh impossible to come up with even a really good study, because the diversity of insects being what it is, how would you even figure out what strategy used to catch insects? And so what's good for bees is not good for other insects. That blue, that's a particular blue, which for some reason is like very, very attractive to bees. It's almost like a super normal stimulation of the blue receptors in their eyes, but it won't work for other insects. And then you've got flying insects, you've got insects in the water, you've got, it's hard to, I don't think it's possible even to do an absolutely a study that really takes into account all the different parameters. So, land mass is so much larger than fresh water. So if you do a comparison between the two, is it like apples and oranges? So I think the point is that, forgetting the details and the numbers, that yes, insects are declining. And then there's instances like the declines in the fireflies, and these are known as lightning bugs, even though they're not bugs, they're beetles. And what they do is they communicate at night. They, have this bioluminescence, and it's a mechanism for attracting the opposite sex. So that it's like the Morse code. And so they have this flash, and the flash is very specific for the species. So that's how they maintain the integrity of the species. So you might have a male emitting, 3 short and then a long, and then the female response. And so, they're kind of complicated. And the insect world being what it is, there are other insect species that mimic this. And so there are, it's a predatory lightning bug that mimics the flash, I think, is of the female firefly. And so the poor male comes, straight to this mimic and, ends up as being dinner. So, but the lightning bugs, people have seen declining populations, and apparently I have not been fortunate to have seen any of these synchronous fireflies. Apparently there's many species in Tennessee, and but only one of them actually has this they do this kind of synchronous flashing, which must really be phenomenal to watch. But the feeling is that, if fireflies are declining, then that is they're in bioindicators of wetlands. And so then you would have, issues with wetlands declining too. So those are just some examples of global decline. So what could be the factors responsible for insect declines? So here I would like to ask y'all to kind of just, what do you think are the various reasons that insects decline? And Brianna, is there any way to, I mean, people can just speak up or?
Yeah, I think this is a good chance to have a discussion. If you have thoughts or opinions, feel free to unmute and share about why we are seeing this decline worldwide. What could possibly be contributing to it? So either unmute or add it to the chat. Both good options, but join to the conversation. It makes for a kind of a fuller opportunity here. Now we already have the big ones. It looks like lack of habitat, pesticide, loss of habitat, pesticide. You know, it's like, it sounds like people have a few ideas about what may be major contributors.
Right.
Does that sound like what you see there? Human interaction?
Okay. Well, a lot of it is anthropogenic, right? Yes, it is basically our activities. So yes, so why do insects decline? Habitat or destruction, fragmentation, which results in habitat loss. You know, we think of insects being in our space, but actually it's we who are in their space. And so when we talk about habitat loss, it's because of, yes, urbanization, agricultural crop production, logging, and then pesticides, whether it's an agricultural crop or wherever, ecotourism, also like with the fireflies, light pollution, the fireflies, climate change, again driven by human activities. And then sometimes you have things, you know, like diseases, like any organism, insects get diseases too, which sometimes could be as a result of some of the things we do, but well, insects get diseases too. And so, you know, just some examples here of our activities. So the annual transport of honeybee hives to the almond orchards, the almonds, as they call in California, there's just acres and acres and acres of these. And these bloom in the month of February. And so beekeepers from a number of states take their hives and they actually kind of settle sometime November, December, get ready. And so by February, the bees are acclimatized and they have all this food to forage on. And so it's like feast after feast after feast after feast for 2-3 weeks. And then boom, the bloom is done. And so now what happens? You've got colonies that are larger in size, but no bloom. And we're talking now March. So, you know, they bring their hives back and trucking them all the way, come all the way down. Here's just to give you an idea of the masses of bees that are in that area at the time. What do they call it? The Super Bowl. And so what happens is when they come back, it's still cold. Minnesota, we're still, what, March? And so you can imagine what kinds of impacts that has on the bees, the stress. This is kind of my personal opinion. To be trucked all the way, to be trucked back, they don't have enough food because the colonies are larger now and they have to be fed, but also kind of the exchange of diseases because you've got bees coming from all over the place. And so yeah, bees without borders and there's all this exchange, all this mixing. And so while there's a huge, huge impact in terms of almond pollination for us, it could have an impact on the bees too. So that's a honeybee. Well, here's the story of Bombas Occidentalis, for which I have personally given it a politically incorrect term, the white ass bee. You could see its white butt there. And the reason for it is to draw attention to this bee. Really interesting story that it used to be a very common pollinator on the West Coast. So we're talking coastal Oregon, California, Washington, British Columbia, and now it's near extinction. What happened? Well, it was a really good pollinator. It was easy to rear. So they took queens from the West Coast to rearing facilities in the Midwest. Maybe they even took them to Europe. And it's just and then when they reared the colonies were sent back to the West Coast and they were primarily to be used in greenhouses. But, you know, even though you have that queen excluder, some queens escape, and within a very short period, the wild population pretty much disappeared in these areas. And so the speculation is that maybe when they were reared in these common facilities, they picked up a pathogen that the species that is used for other areas. So, a company is going to try to optimize space. And so you've got Bombas impatiens, which is a species that is reared for places like the Midwest. And Bombas Occidentalis were reared in the same, maybe a pathogen spilled over. And so when those colonies returned to the West and they escape, they just spread that pathogen. And it is really amazing that you no longer see the species on the West Coast. So all good intentions, the idea was to, develop a pathogen, a pollinator. After all, the honeybee is the same thing. It's been domesticated. The same idea is let's try to get a domesticated bee for the West Coast. And so now, over a very short period, again, human activity, this species is no longer, you get a few here and there, but for the most part on the West Coast, it's not there. So, okay, so yes, there is evidence that bees decline. Why does it matter? So again, I would like to have your opinions. So what? Insects are pests, they're pesky, so many problems with them. Why should we care if insects decline? So let's hear from y'all.
So I want to share that. I don't know how many people read the magazine Scientific America, but they had a special last year about the silent skies and the decline in songbird and insect-eating bird populations. Yeah. And so I imagine, 2 years ago was the whole thing about the insect decline, and 1 year ago is the bird decline. I imagine at the end of this year, we're going to see, wild mammal decline as we start working our way up the food chain. That's one of the things that comes to mind right away.
Very good. Yes. What else?
I'm putting that Scientific America link in the chat if anybody wants to read that. Hopefully it's not behind a paywall.
From the chat, we have food pollination, disrupting the food chain for predators. We need pollinators and food for other species. Bird food, they're indicators of imbalances in ecosystems. They support other animals. Feeding them feeds us. Those are a few of the chat items.
Excellent. So yes, why does it matter? What are the contributions of insects to humans? I have a few more: biodiversity, pollination, food sources, recycling, and model systems for research. So pollination and food sources were the two that y'all brought up. I'll talk a little bit about the others. And so biodiversity and, insects are just incredible. If you look at that diversity, and I tried to pick out as different looking insects as I could. These are kind of the wow bugs, but then you also have, this is kind of the most bizarre bug I have seen. I haven't seen this personally. It's some sort of a tree hopper in Brazil. Why it has those things on the top, besides just, I have no idea. In fact, the article didn't have an idea either. But then there's all this camouflage, and I'm always amazed at this. Look at these bugs. Could you tell that the one there on the top left corner what it is? Or the one in between? Or look at this one at the bottom left side. These are just incredible. And for me, it's also a question of how do they know that, they need to go against a particular background so that they won't be visible. And then you've got these wannabe snakes. Not just in one species, but in so many different species. Again, this is pretty much a defense, just like the camouflage. But then there's also some that, look like poop. And the one on the right side is the caterpillar of the citrus butterfly. It's one of the first insects that I came across when I studied entomology in India. We just came out of the classroom and we're looking around, collecting bugs. And lo and behold, there was, it definitely looks very much like poop. But again, great defense. Then the one on the left side, there is a group of beetles, the chrysomelids, that pretty much put their shit on their back, basically as a defense. So, lots of diversity in insects. And here I just brought out the kind of bizarre ones, but there's diversity at every level. And then, of course, pollination, you all know about this, whether it be the native plants or whether it's an apple or the blueberry, these all need bees. And then you all mentioned this too, food. You can see the birds feeding the young, catching them as they're flying. I think that's a Mormon cricket there in the mouth of this reptile. So yes, definitely. And this is probably one of the biggest impacts that insects have, because they play this very critical piece in the food chain of all the organisms that are higher up on the food chain. But then as recyclers, this is what we do to recycle. But what do the insects do to recycle for us? Well, as soon as there's a dead body on anywhere, the insects get to them very quickly. And they are huge in terms of basically recycling the material. I mean, the blowfly larvae are the very first that get to them, but there's all these other beetles. That's why insects are used in forensic investigations, because you can tell very quickly when a body was killed based on the insect species that have attacked it. In the forest, you've got all this trees, dead trees falling for various reasons, and then you've got all these termites that pretty much, again, recycle the material. The dung beetle, what if all that dung kind of just accumulated? Imagine what it would be like. And in certain regions, because, when you have dung, you also have a lot of flies. And so countries have introduced dung beetles to recycle dung. So yes, I did not know this, that even in the US, to save the cattle industry, they basically, dung beetles are helping. And in Australia, anybody who's been to Australia, they call this what do they call it? The Australian wave. And it's basically that you're all the time pushing the flies away in front of you, because they, especially in areas where they have a lot of cattle, they have a lot of flies. And so apparently they brought dung beetles, and that had a big impact. And then now, this was a recent, March 4th, you've got scientists looking at caterpillars. It's just a wax worm. It's a pretty common moth, wax moth, that apparently eats plastic. Well, some of the issues, of course, is, okay, it's digesting the plastic. What happens? Sometimes insects just sequester them, but what does it do to the, birds that eat it and other things, or can it actually be used for recycling plastic? So, but anyway, there's lots of examples of how insects, are helping us with the recycling. And then insects as model systems for research. We pretty much gave up on Drosophila melanogaster as even being an insect, because the geneticists took it over. But then what is interesting to me is all the recent examples of how insects have led to very interesting research. And there is a book from this whole area of biomimetics, which is basically new technologies that have been inspired by living organisms. After all, they have been on the planet for such a long time and evolved and, adapted to so many different things. What if we kind of get some ideas and insights from them? So a few examples here. Yes, there is this very interesting book. Insects did it first. It's got a new version too. But here are some examples. So here are insect eyes that have inspired new solar design by Stanford researchers. Insects, they have this kind of mosaic. They've got thousands and thousands of these ommatidia that form each compound eyes. And so don't know how these, solar researchers thought about looking at insects for that. Or this is, to me, really interesting. It's a beetle in deserts that it kind of stands with its butt up. So what it does is in the morning, it goes all the way to areas where it can stand on its front legs. And so when the fog condenses a dew, the fog will kind of, droplets of water will then come down, you know, the elytra on the back. They've got these ridges, so it kind of flows through, and then all the water comes to its mouth and it drinks it. And so this company basically started trying to figure out how to use that idea to come up with, you know, this bottle, some different kinds of bottles they're trying to come up to basically gather water from arid regions. And this is, to me, also interesting. I mean, you know, all of this is just information I got from the internet, but there's termites are pretty amazing in the kind of structures that they build. And there are some that pretty much rear fungi because they act as food. So this particular one has fungi which needs a very specific temperature, whereas the surrounding is really hot. So the way they build these, they actually have things like closing and opening vents at different places, and thereby they're able to keep the air inside pretty cool. And so apparently they have structured this shopping center in Zimbabwe using this kind of strategy. So really there are lots of things that we can learn from insects because, you know, yes, they are so diverse, and if you're looking for something, there's probably an insect out there that has figured out how to do it. So, you know, what can we do then to address declines in insects? So I'm going to give you some examples of things that people have tried. So there, you know, the short-haired bumblebee, it's present in Europe, and it's a good pollinator of clovers. New Zealand was raising clover for seed, but New Zealand does not have any bumblebees. New Zealand and Australia, they just don't have any bumblebees. So being part of the Commonwealth, this is over 100 years ago, they imagined this. They took a few species, the queens of a few species from England to New Zealand on ships and released them. And 4 species really established, and then the red clover yield just, you know, quadrupled. And so it's like, wow, great solution. And it's really sad, but when you go there to New Zealand, you will just see these bumblebees everywhere, and you don't realize that they're not native. But, you know, they solved a problem for them. Well, guess what? The species is not being seen in the UK since, 1988 or so. So what did they do? They said, we want our bees back. And so they took bees from New Zealand back to England. And it's interesting, what they did so successfully before did not work 100 years later. And they tried a few times, and they realized finally that the genetic diversity in the New Zealand population is very low now, because they only arose from the few that they introduced such a long time ago. And of course, this became very controversial, because bringing back bees that have, you know, evolved in the meantime back, what is it going to local populations? Well, despite all the controversies, they kept trying. And I heard that recently they actually took some from Sweden to England. And so the idea is, you know, repopulate an area with the same species. So that is, you know, sort of one example of what people have tried to do. But the more common thing is, you know, how in the whole pest management field, which is, you know, where I spent a lot of my career. Again, like it's because of us, right, that there's this whole push for pesticides, because look at these 2 apples, we're all going to pick the one on the left, even though we know that the right one does not have any insecticides, because if it did, then that caterpillar there would be dead. But it's just human nature. We're going to pick the nice, pretty one. We're spending money. We're going to look. In fact, I go to the grocery store. I don't even just look for the best, the one with no blemish. You know, we're very, very picky. We do that. And because of that, people have been trying to figure out how to kill those insects. And then over time, I mean, people looked first for what was out there, botanicals, but then people are using mercury and arsenic, things that were, again, present outside. And then we landed on this wonder pesticide for which, you know, a Nobel Prize was awarded in medicine, because it was amazing for malaria and typhus during the war. So DDT had lots of, it was persistent, very easy to apply, cheap. But then, silence bring to our attention to all the negative impacts. So we continued as entomologists to find other compounds. So we came up with this new group. The one on the top there, we're still using them. But then, there were more safety standards because of the pesticide residues especially in baby food. And so then we landed on this great thing called the safe or reduced risk insecticides. It's like, wow, these were safe to humans, safe to wildlife. But at that time, people were not looking at bees. The 2006 is when attention was drawn by that Pennsylvania beekeeper. And so lo and behold, neonicotinoids, which is safer, reduced risk insecticide, is actually toxic to bees. And so what do we do, right? Here are all the things we're trying to avoid. You got the Japanese beetle, the soybean aphid, the spotted ring drosophila, the brown marmorated sting bug, and this lanternfly, which is really such a pretty insect. It's been there, I think, in Pennsylvania, maybe came up to Indiana. It's something that people are on the watch for if it's going to be coming towards Minnesota. And then, of course, we're all heard about the giant Asian hornet, what do they call it? The murder hornet. So we want to kill all of these insects, right? At the same time, we want to preserve all these insects. And, insects, they're similar in the nervous system. They're similar in so many ways. So, of course, if you're going to kill some, you're going to kill the other. So what do? Well, of course, last time I offered the solution is entomophagy. But what's happening in the world is that people are continuing to try. And so it's like, can we come up with things that are more specific so that we don't kill bees, we don't kill the non-target? And so you'll hear about precision ag or these genetic tactics with the GMOs and the sterile insect technique. Precision ag, people are using drones so that they can kind of find areas in the fields that have the pest, so that you could then only spray certain parts and not the other. Same with the smart sprayer on the right. As it goes past the trees, it can sense where there's a tree, where there isn't, and so you can reduce the amount of spray that you are applying out there. And then there's this whole world of genetics that led to the sterile insect technique, where the idea was, let's replace normal matings with abnormal ones. And so if you flood the populations, how you would do that? Flooding the population with sterile males, so that when the eggs are laid, they are unfertilized, so they'll be sterile. And then ultimately you can get extinction because you'll have more and more of these sterile populations out there. And so objective, unlike any other program, is eradication. With any other program of pest management, you try to bring the numbers down, but here you can actually get extinction. And they did that with the screwworm fly. This is a livestock pest, and it was a huge problem for the cattle industry. And 20 years, 40 million males were released. Now, it's a very expensive project because you have to irradiate the males and then release them, and it works well in confined areas because if you have emigration of normal populations from outside, it won't work, but it was very successful. And that was many years ago. Well, people have picked up on this for mosquitoes. And so what they did is there's this company out of Britain, which is pretty much doing this. And here's kind of interesting what they did. They took the mosquitoes from Cuba and Mexico and then genetically altered them and then released them in these other countries, Brazil and Malaysia and the Cayman Islands. 450,000 modified males released every week for 27 months. So in terms of numbers, for this to work, it is really, really, really large numbers. And they got great reductions in mosquito populations. But in the lab, they found that 3% did produce viable offspring. Their hope was that there will be no viable offspring. So then their claim of the company was that the genes from the release strains would not get into the general population because the offspring would die. And obviously that didn't happen. And so samples of the mosquito, though, when they collected it, they found that some of the genes had passed the genes on to these other populations. So now the concern is you're going to get maybe a more robust hybrid species that will be harder to manage or kill. Well, what they found is that the genes that were passed on were not the genes that were designed to kill, but the genes from the strains in Cuba and mosquito that were used to create these. And so now you do have a hybrid population that is out there. Would that lead to a robust population? Well, that is the concern. However, there is no real health risk from these hybrids. But the issue is, of course, the unanticipated outcome. So they made these mosquitoes in the lab from populations from some countries, released them in other, and there are some mixing of the wild populations, but nothing related to the malaria. And so it's like, okay, no need to be concerned. Well, but that's just it, right? There are all these things being released out there. What about the ethical issues? And so just like with the GMOs, people were concerned many years ago, but that was in agriculture. That was in separated space. Now you're doing mosquitoes right where we all are, humans. And so the ethical issues are quite different. So it really is food for thought. And so in my course, this is a course that I taught this spring to populations. And so here they had to sort of honor students, and they had to do a project. And one of them, actually, they chose this as their topic. And so I'm going to show you what they came up with, how to help the public help insects. So this is what they said. The team behind the research and the new articles have drawn up a 9-point plan that enables individuals to contribute. So avoid mowing your lawn frequently, let nature grow and feed insects. Well, that's kind of interesting that people are talking about the bee lawn, and Minnesota is probably the first state where the legislature actually provided money. So the idea is, instead of having beautiful green lawns, which I do agree look very nice, but people don't like dandelions in their lawns, and yet it's the dandelions that come up early in spring and provide food for the bees that come out early. But what about putting clover in lawns? And so you could get something aesthetic at the same time benefiting in the bees. Plant native plants, many insects need only these to survive. Well, that's true. But when in the bee world, my take on planting is, if your goal is really to increase the number of the populations, native plants may not always be the answer, because a native bee really doesn't know the difference between native species and non-native species. So if you have a field full of clover versus a few lupins, the larger clover field is, in my opinion, going to be more beneficial. Avoid pesticides, go organic, at least for your own backyard. Leave old trees, stumps, and dead leaves alone. They're home to countless species. Now, what was interesting for me is, as these are students, this is the first entomology course they've taken. And in my class, all the students were either engineers, music majors, psychologists. And so this is something that they came up with. So it was pretty encouraging for me. Build an insect hotel with small horizontal holes that can become nests for bees. This is something that, people are doing. Reduce your carbon footprint. This affects insects as much as organisms. Support and volunteer conservation organization. Do not import or release animals or plants into the wild that could harm native species, and be aware of tiny creatures. And I actually can't read the rest of the slide because of the always look on the small side of life. So this is what the students came up with. Well, what I feel, mine is a much simpler list. I think it's all about education, education, education. Balancing. I think it's important that we try to protect diverse organisms, not just focus on some. So the attention has been on bees largely, but to me, the ladybugs, the predators, and especially the detritivores, those that are eating up the dead animals, are so much, very, very important too. And then yes, everybody can plant flowers. they do attract bees, they help other insects, and then of course reduce pesticide use. So there isn't really one thing that would work for all insects. The insects are really so diverse, and it's always going to be conflict between human beings, our needs, and what the insects need. And so we have to find a balance there too, in terms of, there was this talk I remember where they showed a slide of honeybees. This is when, the honeybee deaths were really huge concern, and there was an accident and a lot of bees died on the road, and it's like, are we going to ban driving? No. So, it's important for people to get perspective that we try to do our best, and it's not just insects too, it's birds, it's frogs, and other species also. And so with that, thank you very much, and for giving me this opportunity to talk about something I'm very, very passionate about. And if you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them.
Thank you. It looks like we do have a few questions over in the chat. And one of the questions was, I think this was back when we were talking about bugs from England being taken to New Zealand. What are the risks of introducing insects into non-native environments? And then what are the pros and cons of introducing non-native insects?
So when you think about non-native insects, most of our pests are non-native, and so they become invasive, and and we think about them in the pest world, but it's the same whether even it's a good bug, right? And so what happens is they come in their own environment. There's natural enemies that keep them under certain populations. When you come into a new environment, then you can explode. And so yes, we are familiar with the pests, but then many of y'all are familiar with the ladybug, the Harmonia, which is an introduced species, and now it is doing very well. And so what happens then is there's concerns about what happens with the native species. So the other thing is, when we talk about native, and I was going to mention this, when we talk about native plants being preferable for native bees, and yes, in their native habitat. But our backyards, our front yards, they are not the native habitat of the bee anyway. And so when you have native plants there and you have native bees, they still would be beneficial. But I wouldn't really say that is a native, that coevolutionary interaction that developed is really not the same as it is in the wild. So you always need to be careful when you bring in a non-native species, no matter even if it's a good one. And so the lesson from the British, I don't know, it seemed really dumb to do that. Why would what you took over had very little genetic diversity, and you're talking about a species that declined with the higher genetic diversity. Now you're bringing back this lower diversity population, and you expect it's going to survive. So really what they need to do is look and see why it declined, and then, try and increase, whether it's a particular plant species, whatever it is, build that population, and then introduce the species. Then the other thing is, and I have mixed feelings on this, so that Bombas Occidentalis, which is the one I have experienced with on the West Coast, when I arrived in Oregon, it was almost pretty much gone. But another bumblebee species took its place. And so you have now Bombas Occidentalis is thriving, whereas people barely knew about its existence before. And now it has filled in the niche and exploded, and it's doing very well. So then at some levels, nature kind of evolves too. And so some die, some, do better. So it's hard to say. You can't predict what is going to happen if you do it deliberately. But if it just happens in nature, then, some do very well.
Thank you. Next question is from Rochelle. Should I buy and release ladybugs from a garden center? I have a bunch of aphids in the greenhouse. Is there what's the best way to get rid of them?
So this is interesting. It depends on the source of the ladybugs in that garden center. So ladybugs overwinter, hibernate in aggregations in places like the forests. And so people go and collect them, bag them, and sell them. But what you have to think about is before an insect goes into hibernation, it eats and has all these fat bodies. So when spring comes, it is programmed to fly and burn off that fat before it is hungry enough to come down. So if you put those ladybugs in your garden that originated from an overwintering source, some neighbor is going to benefit, which is not a bad thing. You just may not benefit.
Oh, that's a great answer. Next question. Are there good monarch butterfly programs for schools? I remember personally when I was growing up in Iowa City, we hatched, they grew and then they hatched and then we released them, but we had a tag and release program, which is actually one of the reasons why I think I'm a master gardener today, is because of programs like that. So do you know of any current good monarch butterfly programs for schools?
So I actually haven't looked, but I think the Monarch Watch, there's many organizations, they do have a lot of programs for schools, for individuals. And that is again another example, one of the examples where I think the populations of monarchs are improving. The milkweed, planting of milkweed has helped immensely. Again, that's an example where you look. The thing with the monarch is it is so specific. It doesn't have a broad food range. And so you're knowing the milkweed. And if the milkweed was being killed in all these fields because of, even something like Roundup Ready, which, is wonderful for farmers because then it enables them to put the herbicide that they want without killing the plant, but that could kill things like the milkweed. And so herbicides, yes, have a negative impact. So, it's kind of an interesting experience I had when I was working with native bees with the cranberry growers in Oregon. I asked them to put out my blue vein traps. And this one worker, she said, I really want to help you, but those traps kill bees. So, and I said, that's true. They kill bees. But unless I do that, I will not be able to tell you what bees you have in your area, which is what you want me to do. So here's the deal. Since I am killing the bees, why don't you plant flowers to help the bees? And psychology really, for me, was the lesson I learned there. She was so happy that she could do something. That after that, she completely forgave me for what I was going to be doing. And I think that is an important thing with all conservation is citizen science is amazing. And people feel they really want to help, and if you can give them something to do. So just, planting milkweed is amazing for the monarchs.
Okay, if you have time, I see 3 more questions. The next question is from Anne. Are freshwater insects the only groups of insects which are increasing? And then are there any other groups that are increasing?
So, that's the only recent study that was done, that they are increasing, but things like the monarchs are increasing. I can say you'll have individual species here and there that are increasing. And one of the interesting things, one of the students in my class was like, well, we were talking about COVID-19, and boy, that's the first time I brought it up today. It's that 2 things. One is they said, well, things like locusts and stuff, they have these huge locust swarms in Africa, and they're really a problem now because the pesticides they're not able to get the pesticides there. On the other hand, places like, the smoky, where the fireflies are, since we can't get there, it would probably help the insects because sometimes they just need some time to just recoup. So I would imagine that there would be small pockets like that that would benefit just by, you know, all this social distancing that we're doing. But in terms of more generally, yes, you'll have to go through, I mean, studies, people have found individual studies. It's interesting that bad news sells better than good news. And so the studies that talk about negative and declines are more easy to publish than, and I struggle with this with the bees because I was making a case that in Oregon, where you have 200 crops being raised and so many raised for seed, that is like a huge habitat and is beneficial. And people didn't want to publish that because they really want to publish. It's like, oh yes, but did you find any declines? So they always want that aspect, which is kind of unfortunate.
Okay, our next question, and Brianna, do we still have time to keep going with questions? Okay.
Go right ahead.
Is kind of feeds into one of your last statements, which talking about insects and kind of the image that they have. So how can we give insects a more positive image to the public? And you know, the automatic response to insects is usually what can I do to spray it and kill it? So basically looking at some good publicity for bugs.
Yeah, I think, like I said, it's all about the education. And so an idea came to me just as I was, listening to the question is even places like the state fair and stuff, if we can have some sort of game or some sort of things where it's like for every negative insect, force the person to come up with 5 insects that are actually beneficial. And it's kind of what I did on the first day of my class too, is where I had students just list any insect, and then talk about the benefit or the harm. And it's like at the end of the day, every insect is beneficial at some level, right? Mosquitoes, we only think about malaria, but you know what? There's, 3,000 species of mosquitoes. There's 3 genera with a few species that cause all those diseases. The rest of the mosquitoes are food for the birds and the fish and all these other organisms. Gambusia is, fish that only feeds on mosquitoes. It really needs them. And then think about it. Only the females bite. So all the males are harmless. So it's not going down. Same with the bees, right? The males don't sting. And so, as we start telling more and more stories like that and talking about things like this, I think it is education. People are thirsty for knowledge, what they read. And we're competing against that newspaper. We're competing against what's on TV. You look at that Murder Hornet, 2 sightings, but everybody's talking about it. So, we have to talk more loudly and more often. And you guys
have
really get that.
We do a planting for pollinators class. And we had, it's a lot of interest in that one. And we had a question sent to our community partner and got to me was, I just took that class. I really want to help native bees and local wildlife, local insects, but I'm afraid of attracting murder hornets. What do I do? And this was here in St. Paul. And it's like, okay, educate.
So I would say the answer I would give is, you really shouldn't worry. But if indeed you do catch one of them, you'll be the first one to talk to the Minnesota Department of Ag, and you would have helped us detect it. So please plant it so that we can find it if it's here.
You'd be a local hero. That's a different take on it. I didn't even think of that.
Yeah, exactly. You have been doing a great service.
And then to educate, sorry, Dr. Rao, in an effort to educate, I know that they're, and give good publicity rather than bad publicity. What is their official name? Not a murder hornet is not their actual name.
Oh, it's not at all. So
what is their
unfortunately,
name?
it's the giant Asian hornet.
Okay.
And one of my students who is from Asia, she said a neighbor, she got a really racist comment from a neighbor because so she wanted us to change the name of that insect. I'm like, it is from Asia. You know, we have the European corn borer. It's, you know, but unfortunately, this is what happens, right? I mean, it's an insect.
Yeah.
It's
And then-
from Asia. It's a giant.
And then Brianna, your question was the last question if you wanted to ask.
So this is something I heard last fall about monarch butterflies. You know, there's a lot of local efforts to get the caterpillars and raise them as chrysalis and then release them in the fall or late summer to help contribute to the population. And what I heard from a person I know doing that is that when you raise them as a chrysalis inside, they don't migrate. They just kind of stick around and die. Have you heard any truth to that?
Well, I have heard people talk about it, but in my opinion, it's still beneficial even if they don't migrate, because not all monarchs migrate, and there are actually non-migratory populations too. And so, especially if this is, you know, educational, and in the process, people are learning about the life cycle and learning about metamorphosis and learning about so much. And this is, after all, a good bug. So it doesn't migrate. So you won't add to the statistics in Mexico, but it's still a good thing.
So still worthwhile.
It's still worthwhile. And we really don't know what, I mean, that is one of the most fascinating things ever, in my opinion. How does the great-great-grandchild of this monarch know its way to the same eucalyptus grove or whatever the trees are, I forget, in Mexico? How do they know? How do they go right there? It's just truly amazing. So unless we know that, we won't be able to figure out if the populations, you know, what do we need to do when we rear them to make sure that they will migrate?
This is a great talk. I hope everyone's really excited about bugs. Like, I just put
Yeah,
a
cool.
link to a PDF that I came across in the chat window. There's a group called like Get the Kids Outside, I think, and they put this PDF up on suggestions to parents on how to get your kid to love bugs. And step one is you need to stop being afraid of bugs. And so it's all these recommendations for parents to model brave behavior. So, and then I actually contacted them and they said, feel free to pass this around, spread it far and wide, get people used to bugs. So I'm gonna launch a real quick poll here for members before we start our business meeting. It's part about the talk and part about us as membership. I meant to launch it at the start. So if you have a second, you can just click the 2 questions. Hosts, I'm sorry you don't get to see it.
Just one point, somebody did correct me. It's the Asian giant hornet, not the giant Asian hornet. I always forget which comes first. I should remember it's the giant hornet from Asia.
That's what Google's for. But very good talk, yeah. And I see applauses, so yes, thank you. It's always so interesting to see how this comes about. I have a friend who's deathly afraid of every insect ever under the sun. And this past fall, he said, hey, did you know about this one bug? And I said, yeah. Have you looked at the second bug? And it like opened the doors for him. And now he's sending me all of these links like, can you believe this bug exists? It's like, yeah, I do. He's very excited. And all it took was exposure to a story about one for him to say, these are really neat. I'm going to get him into plants one of these days.
Yeah. So Madagascar hissing cockroaches are a great pet. They have very little work. You don't have to walk them every day. You don't have to feed them for weeks. They ask so little. But boy, a kid with a bug on their hand, I mean, they just can hold it for hours. So I would recommend that Madagascar cockroach as a pet.
Adorable video, and I know somebody here is going to get the willies, but it was like a toddler, and he's in the bathtub, and he's standing there, and there's a spider crawling on him. And he's like, do, walking around. And the kid's like, he's so cute. He loves me. He's giving me hugs. And the mom's doing her best to just be like, he loves you.
Yeah. I think that really is if I could do this for a living, that's what I would do, is just give talks about bugs all the time, because I think there's just so much, and for every negative, if you can come up with a positive and say, okay, but what about this? And I think it is education.
Mm-hmm. So do you have any ideas or suggestions on, as Master Gardeners, our job is also to educate. What avenues, what pathways, what groups would you think have the most influence? What do you think is the best way to educate the folks in Ramsey County, in St. Paul?
So I don't know enough about the program to know, but I know you all do things like at the library and stuff. And so wherever you have an opportunity, is to whatever program, you can always have a little section on something related to, insects. And, it's like the good, the bad, and the uglies. It's like they're all of them, right? And so, and I think educating adults is great, because then they can pass it on. It's really, train the trainer kind of thing. We need to actually spread it. And for me, like I say, at school and talking to the university kids, they go back to their rooms and talk about it to their, roommates. And now, of course, ever since COVID-19, they've been talking about it with their parents. And so if you can get, some people excited to share it with others, each one, talk about it with 5 people, I think it's like, yeah, okay, take anything. Whatever, it's like, okay, whether it's an A to B or it is GMO or whatever it is, okay, ask me questions, and then, get them to start thinking.
That's good advice. I know there's a thing in the chat here about how do we get people over the hump, right? How do we get them to stop thinking about all the bad and start thinking about I like your idea of, tell me one good thing this bug does. And you're like, okay, yeah, I suppose it is. It does have a role to play, and a pretty important one at that.
Like with the stinging, like I said, both with the bees that sting or any of those, Hymenoptera that sting, or the mosquitoes, it's only half the population. The males just don't do it. And it's like, think about it. Males don't bite us. Why? Because males don't need blood. Why do the females need blood? To produce eggs. And by the way, not all mosquito species need blood to produce eggs. And so you kind of slowly go and say, if you start to think about it, we're talking a very, 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 very small part of just this one mosquito group that is harmful. Is it fair to blame all of them for just the few?
Well, it's kind of like, I just put a link in the chat to one of those posters I've seen of all of these different bee types. And, to get angry at a yellow jacket in September that's stinging you and say all bees are bad. And it's like, do you even have an idea? Do you know how many bees there are? It's not just this guy or this lady, as it were.
Right.
No. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us in this conversation, bringing all that information. I think that was fantastic. Just to
My
hear
pleasure.
everything.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I forgot to mention this in Dr. Rao's introduction, but you can see with all her creative ideas about how we should handle this, that she is really a fantastic teacher, and she's won many educator awards. And I think that we've really had a demonstration of this tonight. So thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. It was wonderful.
You're welcome.
Fantastic.
See you around somewhere, sometime when we can all get out of our homes.
Thank you.
One day. All right, so we are going to go ahead, Frank.
I was just going to say it's a great meeting we've had, and 92 participants.